Thank you for taking the time to attend our webinar. My name is Sam and I'll be your host for today. We do encourage any questions you may have, so please feel free to add them to the chat and we'll address them at the end. However, we do value your time, so if we do run out of time, we will email the answers out as well as a recording to this event. On that note, I'd like to welcome Robert Buck, Founder and Managing Director of Diamond IT. He'll provide an introduction today for our webinar, and our presenter, Gavin Hall. He's one of our business technology consultants. So on that note, over to you, Rob.
Thanks, Sam. I do need to update that LinkedIn photo. I realise that, yeah, it's making me look younger and younger every year, so might need to update that one. Yeah, so as Sam said, I'm just going to do a quick introduction, and as you can see here, we've got the classic cyber criminal hoodie shot, and this is obviously the internationally known symbol for cyber criminals, and a strong recommend if you ever see someone in a hoodie like that sitting at one of the desks at work, be very concerned, because yeah, they may be up to no good, especially if you can't see into the hoodie. So we've got this quote here, and we try to keep our stats as relevant as possible. I think sometimes you see these stats about, you know, on average, like $4 million and those sorts of things, but they don't really associate very well for small business. But as you can see, still quite an expensive exercise, as well as the reputational damage that can come with that. And they are increasing. I guess our message for a while now really is that cybersecurity goes beyond technology. It's a lot of the breaches that occur, frankly, do tend to occur for fairly simple reasons. So even the Optus breach from a little while back now, it was basically a fairly fundamental error from one of the software developers. And the way these things tend to get portrayed in the media, and I guess it's the PR machines that do this, is that they love the term sophisticated attack. It is the way they portray it, but a lot of the time it is pretty much something simple. But I guess the problem is there's a lot of something simples and a lot of that to keep on top of. So that's where the concept of governance really comes in, and just ensuring that all of those doors are closed is a job to itself. The other thing I would say is that we're seeing more and more pressure from external bodies, you know, government, as well as cyber insurers are really starting to lift their standards. So cyber insurers, obviously they see what they get as claims and they study them and they see where the holes are. And so the pressure they put on their customers is typically related to what they're seeing as the major threats. And so one of the themes that we're starting to see at the moment, potentially have some customers who've been asking us about this recently, is mobile device management. So I think Gav's going to speak a little bit to that later on. That's just something that only around about 2% of organisations are doing at the moment, but certainly a very, it's just as possible to have those sorts of breaches as others. And I think we've got a stat that we've been talking to customers about recently, where about 80 million phones per year are lost or stolen, and you need to make sure that that door's locked as well, because in the world of BYOD, there might be some pretty simple security measures that may not be in place. So again, I guess just to wrap up my intro, really this is about governance of the way that you handle cyber. It's not necessarily about having phenomenal cybersecurity experts. It's really about just making sure that a lot of different doors are closed. And if you can achieve that, you put yourself in a significantly better position in terms of being protected. So I'll throw back to you, Sam. Thanks, everyone.
Great, thanks, Rob. Certainly some ominous stats in there. So our goal today is to provide you a holistic overview on how to approach cyber resilience. So on that note, I'm going to pass over to Gav.
Thanks, Sam. So if we cast our minds back 12 months, the media was full of news about Optus, Medibank, healthcare industry, and many others. Almost every day there was articles about data breaches, cybersecurity, and business technology. Personal information being compromised was at the forefront of everyone's minds. Now, if we fast forward to today, what do we see? There's been strides in the legal space to strengthen Australia's position on the approach of securing personal information. You might have seen some articles about that recently at what's happening at both the state and federal government level. There's still data breaches. Cybersecurity attacks are still being reported in the media. That part hasn't changed. Some media subscribers might view this as, okay, so 12 months ago, we had a series of attacks. Work's now happening to stop that from reoccurring. Great. But without trying to use the analogy of whack-a-mole here, the threat landscape has also advanced dramatically. The use of artificial intelligence tools, for example, has exploded across many industries, from generating written documents to designing images, and now it's being used in cyber attacks. Social engineering and phishing were once easy to spot. There was poor grammar, bad spelling. However, many of these are now backed with AI, making it much harder for people to spot. And last year, Australians alone lost over $3 billion to scams already. You can imagine how having AI behind this would take that number to a whole new level. So today we'll be exploring this holistic approach to cyber resilience. And this slide is to indicate that we'll have a number of different topic areas and a mix of themes that will run consistently throughout. You'll begin to see how these themes come together as we progress.
Thanks, Gav. Certainly some important themes in there for business leaders to consider. So with pressure mounting on business leaders, let's start with cyber accountability.
Sure. So we'll start here sharing a quote from the Minister for Home Affairs and the Minister for Cybersecurity, in that directors have a critical role to play here, and they do need to lift their own cyber literacy levels. And we also need to really reinforce that point that this is a risk that can never be eliminated. It can be effectively managed, however. And so that quote's from last year, 2022. If we dial forward to a more recent quote from the AICD this year, we've got 53% of directors believe cyber attacks have impacted their board's risk appetite, even more so than inflation and the COVID-19 pandemic. So that begs the question then, what can be done to improve cyber accountability? So just on 12 months ago, it's actually October 2022, the AICD and CSRC jointly published a set of principles that can be used to provide a top-down approach and assist board members in meeting their accountabilities. For those on the call who are familiar with these, now is a great time to reflect on what you may have adopted within your teams. For those not so familiar, we'll take a look at these now. And I note that this report is freely available online, and we can look to provide a link to this after the session. So firstly, having defined roles and responsibilities, who is the person accountable for information security in your organisation? Do they have what they need to do in order to do that effectively? And what roles and responsibilities do third parties perform for you? Third parties are engaged by many organisations, but we need to remember that it comes back to the organisation having accountability and ownership of the risks. Having a cyber strategy to set the direction is very important. This provides boards and top management with an understanding of what is required for the organisation to be able to achieve its objectives in a secure way. It also aids in the wider business strategy formation. It helps with planning and forecasting, not just from a financial perspective, but also the changes necessary for security to support these growth and expansion initiatives. The size of these strategies is very dependent on who you are and what you do. It doesn't need to be a daunting activity for small and medium businesses, but consider this an opportunity to build capabilities in people, processes, and technology. For example, you might start small and this year focus on beginning an Essential 8 implementation and perhaps just reviewing the security risks of your top 3 suppliers. Having risk management practices that incorporate cyber threats and vulnerabilities provides a means for you to identify risk and how you want to manage them. Reporting and visibility around this helps directors to satisfy their accountabilities, but it also allows for a focused dialogue in teams around what factors might be impeding you from meeting your goals. Which brings us to the fourth point, cyber culture. What's being done in your organisation to build that culture in the workplace? It's an area that many organisations do underinvest. Cyber awareness training and phishing tests are excellent ways to start this journey. Also, incorporating cyber risk management practices into day-to-day process is a sure way to gain traction because it involves the team at a grassroots, hands-on level in these types of activities. And lastly, having a plan for cyber incidents and rehearsing this is critical. Some organisations have what's known as a BCP, business continuity plan, or a DR plan, disaster recovery. These types of things deal with business interruptions, and typically a lot of the content is around responding to fires, floods, utilities aren't available. But what we need to remember here is that a cyber incident response plan is specific. Now, without getting into the details of cyber incident response plans here, it's important to rehearse the different incident types as a desktop exercise and give yourself the opportunity to build out a playbook as to how you might respond to these different threats. So, for example, if you had a ransomware attack today, when the attack happens and you're held at ransom, how will you communicate with them? Who will communicate with them? What type of help will you need? Who's going to provide that? Where will you get it from? Communication, what will you say to them? How will you say it? Because it's likely that regulators, insurers, law enforcement, and most certainly your customers will be wanting these details, and they'll be wanting it as soon as possible. So to close out this section, I'll just highlight here that some of the themes that we've addressed here relate to strategy, management and leadership, risk management, as well as incident response.
Great, thanks, Gav. Wow, there's certainly so much more to unpack there at a later date, maybe another webinar perhaps. So we often get questions on how to stay up to date with the ever-changing legal and regulatory landscape. Where do we start and what's coming?
Sure. So here we'll take a look at a high level, some of the changes happening in the wider legal and regulatory landscape that are likely to impact across a number of industries. And we'll start that with SOCI, the Security of Critical Infrastructure Act. Now this aims to build resilience across 11 industry types and 22 asset types. These are areas considered critical to the country. So of those 11 industry types, for example, we're talking about things like defence industry, healthcare and medical, financial services markets. So organisations that are required to comply with SOCI need to be actively managing risk. In this context, that includes cyber. It's about ensuring critical services are available, For example, we want to avoid a situation where a regional shopping centre's ATM can't be accessed because of a bushfire in another state. That sounds like a very extreme example, I know, but I make this point to illustrate the need to consider the various types of risks faced by people controlling these assets. It's paramount with the breadth of third-party relationships that we now work with. So at a federal level, you may have heard about proposed changes to the Privacy Act. This is getting a lot of media attention at the moment. The government recently published a report in response to over 100 proposals received from consultation about the proposed changes. I've picked out 4 points to talk about here today. The first is the $3 million exemption. So that exemption for small business, if removed, would likely mean that small business, regardless of size, would be requiring to comply with the Privacy Act. We understand this could introduce new or additional governance activities within many small businesses. Secondly, the definition of personal information is proposed to be widened, no longer about, but relates to an individual. Say that again. Personal information is no longer information about an individual. It's information that relates to an individual. It's a very fine change, but can have very broad implications for what that means in an organization. For example, a user's behavior, like location coordinates in a mobile app and similar things, are relied upon by many organizations offering digital services. This type of information will likely need to be considered in terms of how is it collected, what else is collected that relates to an individual, and how do we now keep that secure in a similar way that we secure names, address, date of birth. The PIA, or Privacy Impact Assessment, is something that's been around for quite a while now. Guidance for this is freely available on the OAIC website. However, the proposal seeks to mandate this to be undertaken when you're performing activities that are considered higher risk to the security of personal information. And the last point here, in relation to small medium business and coming back to that $3 million threshold, by having that in place would require data breaches to be reported within 72 hours. So at a state level, New South Wales is actually leading the charge with this. Queensland is likely to be a close follower with a similar set of changes. This New South Wales PPIP, which is essentially about providing transparency and mandatory data breach reporting for public sector agencies. In the aged care industry, many are poised to see the release of a new data and digital strategy and what that means for the wider industry. We are aware there's been struggles in this sector in terms of data availability, integration, as well as legacy technology challenges. It's likely that the release of this will trigger a review of many aged care providers in their approach to delivering IT services and likely trigger some new projects within the industry. And lastly on this slide, APRA's CPS 230. So whilst APRA is being known as the supervisor of Australia's financial system, it's not a party that many small to medium businesses may have encountered or even heard of. I've included mention of their new standard on operational risk here because it does include elements of business continuity and third-party risk management. The breadth and depth of what this means to be implemented for even some of the larger banks within the time frame has been the focus of many industry discussions. However, the push to have greater risk management of third parties can result in additional due diligence, security risk assessment requests, and those targeted in small to medium business that are providing services to these larger groups. That could result in then new contractual requirements or having to implement enhanced security and risk management solutions in order to be able to continue to provide those services. So in summary, for a small to medium business, what can you do here with helping to be resilient? Firstly, staying up to date with news as these changes progress, in particular Privacy Act changes, and adopting the PIA, the Privacy Impact Assessment that I spoke of. These 2 points are really easily actionable and will help you give a much more informed view about the type of personal information you're collecting, how it's used or processed, how it's controlled and stored. Because it's easier to know where you want to get to when you know where you're coming from. So in this section, we've explored risk management once again. We've also explored the themes of information management, business continuity, and data breaches.
Thanks, Gavin. So the Essential 8 is effectively becoming essential to organisations these days. So what approach do you recommend for businesses to look to adopt these strategies?
Sure. So up until now, we've been talking about people and process, but this is where we shift into technology and we look at the Essential 8. Now, this was initially designed as a set of strategies that can be applied to internet-connected networks in order to help you prevent, limit, and recover from cyber attacks. So if we look at those 8 items, 4 of those are focused around how do we prevent an attack happening, application control, patching applications, Microsoft Office macros, and some hardening. 3 of the controls relate to limiting the impact of an attack, done by restricting privileges, having multi-factor authentication, and patching operating systems. Whilst lastly, daily backups helps recover from cyber incidents. It's also worth noting that there's 3 levels of maturity when it comes to implementing this, and the strength, if you like, of these controls increases as you progress up that maturity ladder. It's also worth noting you can be at varying levels of maturity at times. For example, you might be a level 1 at patching applications, but you might be a level 2 when it comes to backups. So it's understood that various Australian governments and their agencies have in fact mandated the Essential 8 level 1 compliance. And there's been dialogue about further lifting that to a level 2 as standard for government agencies. However, whilst it's not mandated in the private sector, what we can observe is this is becoming a contractual requirement in some industries, particularly those that might interface with defence, health, or even dealing with the government. And in some cases, that then leads to a need to undertake an annual attestation saying, yes, we have this, or in some cases, a verification, maybe that's an audit, to make sure that you're complying with those contract obligations. And that in itself then drives about a process to need to make sure that what you have done is kept current and accurate as your network changes and things improve, situations change. So I guess you might be thinking, what are the drivers for this? Obviously, chains of compliance through contracts is one of them. In many cases, it's the risk posture that your clients have taken, which then creates the need for them to ask you about having Essential 8. It may come about as a result of your own risk assessments or even just following good business practice. The thing that many industry stakeholders like about the Essential 8 is that if you do nothing else, it's the simplest place to start building a healthy technology security posture. You don't need to implement all 8 at once, so if cost or resources are an issue, you could potentially stagger this over a period of time, and you may wish to couple that with undertaking a risk assessment when doing that phased approach. It's something to consider as an inclusion in developing that cybersecurity strategy that I touched on earlier. So the themes that we've talked about here again, risk management is a feature, business continuity again is a feature related to this, and we've talked about the Essential 8 being applicable to internet connected networks. You might have noticed that subtlety when I introduced the Essential 8 and I said that it was designed with internet connected networks in mind. But there's a plethora of other things that we use. Many of us use a PC at work, creating documents throughout the day, sending emails, and then we might use our own mobile phones for responding to emails on the train on the way home. It's so easy to connect and do what we need to do. So you might be thinking, same, right? But it's different. The threats and vulnerabilities for different technologies may require different control sets. So if we have a look at that as an example, in some organizations, operational technology and legacy systems have often been in place for many years. They can use unsupported software platforms, which heightens the security risk. It may also require significant effort to retain these in a modern environment. On the other side of the page, if we look at fast changing, lots of organizations have mobile phones, tablets, which particularly have software updates, new apps, and changes on the daily. If we're also then allowing bring your own devices, it adds additional complexity as the organization doesn't have full control over these. You don't own them. So you may then look to require to adopt a policy that provides direction to people on what is and isn't allowed in the workplace with BYO. We also need to remember that where staff are using their personal devices, accessing company information like emails, they may also have company information saved on their own devices. But at the end of the day, people go home, and in some cases, they share that device with kids or a partner, and it may not even have a PIN code. So for these reasons and more, it's worth considering other devices in your overall approach to security. Guidance is available from the Australian Cybersecurity Centre in relation to mobile devices, and it also has a detailed manual of controls that can be considered for use in securing other technologies across an organisation. Here we've touched on BYO devices, mobile devices, and operational technology.
Thanks, Gav. The line between work and personal devices certainly has blurred of late. This is a good segue actually to corporate governance, which does play a large role in mitigating cyber risks. So again, where do we start?
Thanks, Sam. So a lot of people start with Google. If you try and search the word governance in a search engine, and then you click images, you see diagrams that are just full of words. So to save this distraction and keep your attention here, I've gone with a very short and brief slide. Buckle up, we won't be here too long. Governance is important when managing risk. And again, when I say risk here, I mean cyber and information security inclusive. Risk needs to be considered throughout your process. Now, large organisations have typically established policies and processes around many of the things that we see here on the screen. However, regardless of size, there's many common activities that take place. So think about your environment. Meetings are held, decisions are made, changes take place, people come and go, we deal with external parties, and often, sometimes, maybe things don't go to plan. So what can we do to be resilient in this space where you haven't established governance processes, or you do have some, but you're coming from a low level of maturity? Some ideas that you can start to adopt help build resilience within this space could be considering each decision that you need to make, what could go wrong and how would you deal with it if it did go wrong? Secondly, when it's time to renew contracts and agreements with third parties, you might like to consider getting some external assistance and undertaking a more detailed security review. Thirdly, when introducing new changes, think about what could go wrong there. What are the risks? When we hire new staff, we give them access to systems and equipment. Do they need that access? What can they do with that access? For many smaller businesses, the introduction of governance can seem daunting, especially again coming from that low baseline of maturity. So if you're only just starting this journey, you might like to consider making a goal that risk is your focus for the coming month. Just pull together a really simple list of risks that you think you might have, and that gives you the basis of a risk register. You can then use that at team meetings, maybe talking about 2 or 3 points only in the beginning, but it'll help you with engaging your team and start to build that cyber awareness culture and embed this as part of your ongoing process. From there, if you need some assistance to qualify the risk, so do we understand what the risk is? What can happen? You may like to involve a discussion with an expert, but once you've got that understanding, you can then much more easily quantify what the impact might be to you and your organisation. And lastly, thinking about how visible risks are. Do you have a way for your teams to identify and escalate these? Find a way to make it easy for people to identify them. Perhaps a standard agenda item in team meetings, having a way for people to report them, and consider it even within the processes shown here. The takeaways from this is keep it simple. So if we look at governance on a post-it note here, size matters. Many of these challenges are common, but they're faced on different scales. Agility and building from fundamentals is important. You can start small and plan to build on things over time by including these in that cybersecurity strategy that we've already spoken about. And from a visibility perspective, if you're not asking about risk, you might not be told what the risks are, and therefore you won't know. Make sure it's part of the process and part of those conversations. In this section, we've touched on leadership and management, as well as risk management, which you'll note have emerged in many of the prior topics today.
Thanks, Gav. Love the post-it note analogy to keep things simple. So to round out, we often see firsthand with our customers how cyber insurance requirements are changing constantly and driving security changes. Can you provide some insights for us, please?
Okay, so when people first think about insurance, a classic example that comes to mind is your car. You've probably heard someone saying in the past, it's insured if this happened, or it's insured if that happened. But within the cyber landscape, the nature of threats and vulnerabilities are ever changing. Unlike cars, where you can possibly count the number of types of claims on your fingers, maybe toes as well. One of the trends that we're seeing across industries is the additional due diligence that insurers are looking for when providing that coverage. Quite simply, they're interested in what you do, how you do it, and what sort of controls you have in place to protect against cyber threats and vulnerabilities. Because after all, these are your business risks and you're looking to transfer or mitigate these. So naturally, they are wanting to know this in order to assess the likelihood and consequence and then get to what is the premium. You might have received a questionnaire from an insurer asking about this in the past. Sometimes they're brief, maybe even a page. In other cases, they're many multiples of pages and they're asking what sort of security items you have in place and going into great detail. So from a must-haves perspective, we observe there's a number of controls that are vastly becoming the norm now from an insurer's perspective. Do you have multi-factor authentication? What are you doing about protecting endpoints? Is there training undertaken for staff? Have you got some kind of plan in terms of how you respond to incidents? And do you have backups? Now, if we look at those items alone and we look at it through an Essential 8 lens, These items here shown on screen are very much about preventing attacks and then with the backups recovering from incidents. But the landscape is changing. And so what we can see now is that insurers are asking for other information about other areas. For instance, top management, how engaged are they with security risk assessment? How engaged are they with the management activities of those risks? We talked about the Essential 8 earlier, but there's an expanded interest in that, particularly around now how do we limit the impact of attacks? And there's also an emerging trend to get more information about what is being done to protect against other vulnerabilities. That could be vulnerability scanning, and that as a term I know can be interpreted quite widely, but it may be as simple as running a scan to make sure that systems are up to date with the latest patches. Penetration test is another one that can be seen on these questionnaires where attempts are made to essentially hack into you. And then SEAMSOC, which is a very interesting one. So that stands for Security Incident and Event Management and Security Operations Center. So this is a solution, if you think of it like a bucket, it ingests or takes in all kinds of different journals and logs from different systems. So maybe it's 365, maybe it's Windows events and others, and then it works to analyze these before alerting a security team where there's an anomaly. These things typically run 24/7, and as an example, it might be a case of someone has logged in from an unusual location, and straight after that, we start to see a lot of high traffic of files being transferred out of the network. It looks to analyze those different logs as a series of events and then trigger alerts. So that sounds quite sophisticated, but it's many of these emerging items that are starting to feature on those due diligence and questionnaire forms. And we can expect to see them more commonly adopted perhaps over the medium and longer term. And I guess to round out this section, insurers want to know about your risks and what you're doing to manage them. So we've touched on here insurance as a topic, contractual requirements, and risk management. And so if we pull all of this together and circle back to the themes that I shared at the start and touched on at the end of each section, we can see throughout three things really stand out here: data breaches, risk management, and business continuity. If we know the data that we have, where it is, how it's protected, and we're able to identify and appropriately manage the risks that we have, we're then in a much better position to make sure that our operations continue uninterrupted and that we're better placed to handle incidents. So what I'm saying here is that these areas are paramount in building cyber resilience and are core elements across all of those 5 topics and for inclusion into that cybersecurity strategy. So where to start when initiating this holistic approach? If I recap one point from each of the sections that we've spoken about today, the first is having that cyber strategy. It really helps bind the organisation and provide that direction. It informs budgets and activity planning. It provides the foundation for change. Secondly, being aware of that regulatory and legal landscape and asking yourself, what are the privacy and data risks that we face as a result of the decisions or the changes that we're making? On the Essential 8, make it part of your journey, but don't forget about other devices. Embed cyber risk activities into existing processes and engage frequently on these. And from a cyber insurance perspective, consider what do you need in terms of cover? What controls might you need to adopt in the future to manage that risk profile? And so at this point, I'll touch on how Diamond IT can help in this space. We can assist with the preparation of cybersecurity strategies, policy development. We can provide support and analysis to conduct privacy impact assessments. We can assist in many facets of risk management, which does include checklists, third-party supplier assessments. We can help prepare cyber incident response plans. We can also facilitate mock exercises of these. And again, those mock exercises, a few people in a room for a short space of time. Cyber awareness upskilling, whether that's face-to-face or online training. We can assist with the Essential 8 and mobile device management implementations. And for organisations that might have some skill sets or some subject matter experts internally, if you just require assistance for general business analysis or perhaps some project management and cybersecurity consulting, we can help there as well.
Oh, great. Thank you, Gavin. I tell you, I'm in awe of your knowledge across all of these areas. I'm sure today's presentation is just the tip of the iceberg. And I'd like to thank everyone who joined us today for taking the time to attend this webinar. There has been a lot of information presented, which we will summarise and make available with resources and links for more information that Gavin may have touched upon during the presentation, as well as a copy of the webinar. And in the meantime, please do reach out if you'd like to discuss any of the content presented today.